What made Hans Zimmer one of the most successful film composers of all time? A blend of hard work, skill, a pinch of luck, and one undeniable influence. Ask anyone familiar with Zimmer, including Zimmer himself, and you'll get the same answer. Ennio Morricone.
How is it possible that you can recognize a piece of Ennio Morricone on the first note?
That iconic sound, meant to mimic coyotes in the old American West, became something more than just a sound effect. It came to represent vastness, emptiness. Desert landscapes littered with tumbleweeds and sun-bleached cattle skulls, or modern office buildings on a Friday afternoon in the post-COVID era. But back in 1966, when The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly hit theaters, the coyote howl was just one of many innovations Morricone brought to film scoring through the spaghetti westerns. One of the strangest cinematic subgenres, American westerns with American actors, but shot in arid regions of Italy and Spain by Italian directors. They turned Clint Eastwood into an icon and made Ennio Morricone one of the most sought-after film composers in the industry. Why? Morricone had a unique recipe. He refused to be limited by orchestration norms. The coyote howl, for example, was written for an ocarina, an obscure and ancient clay flute that I just had to figure out how to play, but human whistling and this iconic moaning harmonica. These weren't just fair game in Ennio's world, they were essential. As were real-world sounds. Tin cans, creaky wooden ladders, whip cracks, gunshots. Anything that could contribute to a layered and immersive soundscape. But he also knew better than anyone how to deliver the delicious, with sweeping, unforgettable melodies that just hit you right in the chest. This whole approach, the mix of unexpected sounds and deep melodic emotion, was what captivated the 12-year-old Hans Zimmer. Born in post-war Germany in a home with no television, schooled in the three German Bs, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, one fine day, he snuck into a cinema to watch the 1968 spaghetti western Once Upon a Time in the West, and left knowing exactly what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. For a lot of us classical nerds, Zimmer's story hits pretty close to home. Okay, maybe not the unimaginable global fame part, but that moment when you start listening to the score as intently as you watch the movie, that moment. We all have that one film where the music just got us, where we realized that the music was better than the movie. It lived in our heads until we found the soundtrack, and then we wore that soundtrack out until our brain ran dry of serotonin. For me, that was Morricone's score for The Mission. And I know I'm not alone. There are millions of Gen Xers who had the same exact experience, but there are millions more who were first gripped by a Hans Zimmer score. But here's the thing. even with all the overlap between original film scores and classical music, there's still this weird tension between the two worlds. A debate. For some, film music just doesn't belong in the classical world, while others say it's a desperately needed gateway genre that brings new audiences to the concert hall and creates more work for classical musicians. So in this video, I want to dig into that complicated relationship we classical nerds have with film music, using Zimmer and Morricone as reference points. We'll talk about what needs to happen for film music to even get to the concert hall. What about John Williams? How did Morricone change film music's recipe? And how did Zimmer take it mainstream? My name's David. I'm a classically trained musician who also grew up with Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, and then fell head over heels in love with movie music. Let's go. Okay, how many of you didn't know that this was music for a ballet? If you didn't, it's because Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet is now more commonly performed with the orchestra on stage than with dancers on stage. Why? Well, the music is great enough to stand on its own, so the original format has been largely replaced by a condensed version of the score for just the orchestra. This condensed thing is called a concert suite, and lots of ballet music has been suited. Stravinsky's Petrushka, The Firebird, The Rite of Spring. All were born in the orchestra pit and later adapted to standalone concert pieces that now get more stage time than the ballets. Why am I going on about ballet? Because a lot of film music has followed the same path to the concert hall. When music is great enough to graduate from supporting role to headliner, it has to go through the sweet spot. Which brings us to the undisputed king of the film to concert crossover, John Williams. You can't talk about film music without at least mentioning John Williams. Back when I was a freelancer, his Star Wars suite was a staple in off-season pops and children's concerts, very often with an element of cosplay. Clearly still is. Superman, Jaws, E.T., Indiana Jones, Jurassic Park. It might seem obvious why these scores have such high crossover appeal. Yes, they're good for ticket sales. They're blockbusters and familiar to a huge diverse audience that spans way beyond your usual classical concert goers. But there are other important factors behind the scenes. Williams uses musical language that's instantly recognizable to classical audiences. He's the most prominent of the symphonic traditionalists, a group that includes Hollywood giants like Max Steiner and the extremely underappreciated Erich Korngold, who might just need a video of his own someday. Scores by these folks are action-packed and employ enormous forces. And their roots trace back to the programmatic romantics like Richard Strauss, the Gustavs, Mahler, and Holst. And of course, classical music's favorite asshole, Richard Wagner, creator of the most ambitious work in the operatic repertoire, the Ring Cycle, which has its own concert suite versions for those of us who can't bear to sit through 17 hours of opera. I did it once and never again. But while his scores are big and bold, Williams still colors inside the lines. He sticks to traditional orchestration. There's no need to find exotic instruments or have to mess with mics, synths, and gear, which are anyway somewhat taboo for hardcore classical purists. Classical players like, and dare I say, respect Williams' scores. They can be exhilarating and challenging. And that's generally a winning combo for the players. But what happens when film composers color outside the lines? Ennio Morricone represents the first bud of a new branch of film composers that later included Hans Zimmer, who decided to go their own way. His style was shaped by two contrasting influences. First, there was his early career where he arranged pop songs for broadcast on Italian television. His winning trick was to give unique spins to already popular songs, which then made them even more popular without sounding recycled. And then there was his mentor and teacher, Goffredo Petrassi, and other fierce mid-century modernists like John Cage, whose only rule was to break all the rules of classical music. So what happens when you combine catchy commercial appeal with avant-garde freedom? You get scores that are something else. More versatile and more visceral. You get atmosphere, the gritty real-world texture, and good old-fashioned harmony. Morricone's music vacillated between his experimental side and his popular side, yet both sides informed each other. And that's the recipe, the one that defines Morricone's line of film composers. They're free to use whatever instruments, harmonicas, ocarinas, electric guitars, slapsticks, jaw harps. Instruments you don't usually find in the orchestra. Zimmer has used more non-trad instruments than I can list. He used the duduk, an obscure Armenian double reed instrument in Dune Part 2, giving the score its now iconic, hot, wheezy breath of the desert sound. And maybe more than anyone else, Zimmer helped bring electronic instruments into the mainstream of film scoring, turning what was once fringe into standard practice. That influence is all over today's most ambitious soundtracks. You can hear it in Ludwig Göransson's Mandalorian score, spaghetti western meets analog synths and throat singing. His Sinners soundtrack, no spoilers, but it's one of the best scores I've heard in a long time, so check it out. Zimmer, and now Göransson and others, took Morricone's recipe and expanded it to match the scale and sensory ambition of today's visual effects. Morricone's tin cans and wind machines, now quaint in their simplicity, have been replaced with Zimmer's kitchen sink digital soundscapes that crawl under your skin and vibrate your lungs. This is all great, right? So what's the problem? Zimmer and Morricone both pushed boundaries. But there's a dividing line. On one side, music that's interesting and appealing to classical nerds on its own. On the other, music built for spectacle that literally no longer fits in the concert hall. It needs an arena. Zimmer knows his audience. His Hans Zimmer live shows have toured the world since 2014. They're concerts, sure, but also shows. Flashy, immersive, packed with effects. Zimmer, who's also a very savvy businessman, recognizes his music's popularity among the vast audience of moviegoers and leans all the way in. Are classical fans showing up? I don't know, but if they are, it's probably with a bad attitude. Speaking for myself, I've always been a sucker for big budget blockbusters, even as I know many classical compadres who just can't stand them. And I think Zimmer scores are incredibly effective at saucing up their films. The soundscapes are magnificent. And when the melodies come, they get the job done. But after 6 weeks of being immersed in these scores, I'll say this. They don't always hold up on their own. Not in the way that concert music typically does. My preference, after all this, is to just enjoy them in their original format. As in, just watch the movie. What do you think? Are you a classical nerd who thinks I've missed the mark? Have you ever been to a Hans Zimmer live show, or are you going soon? And to my fellow Morricone fans who know why this video dropped on July 6th, I see you. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe, damn it!
This could be my biggest hit!